And we will begin. Jai Bhim, Salam, Namaskar to everyone who's joining us from different parts of the world. We do begin a little bit late just to give people, particularly in South Asia, to manage internet connections, etc., and to get on board. My name is Anjali Arundekar, and I am the director for the Center for South Asian Studies here at UC Santa Cruz. We are now in our fourth year. I realized that this morning and was astounded at how much time has passed since we first began, which was at the heart of the pandemic. And our first session was on Zoom. And it was a place of enormous sanctuary and conversation for so many of us that even though now we are ostensibly not post the pandemic, but around it or in its environs somewhere, we wanted to continue our commitment to keeping some of our sessions on Zoom, to keep it open to global audiences, and to keep some sessions in person and on hybrid. And before I begin, I also want to give a big shout out to my graduate fellow Radhika Prasad, who is managing everything from behind the scenes and is making me look fantastic with all the right filters, etc. I'm just kidding. But before I say more about the series and more about our wonderful speaker, Sahana Ghosh, I need to acknowledge, of course, that the land on which UCSC stands is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking UP tribe and the Amamatsun tribal band, which is working hard to restore traditional stewardship and practices on the lands that were taken away through continued occupation. I also want to remind us, as I do every time I open, as many of our Indigenous feminist comrades have reminded us, that acknowledgements such as these are not the same as relationships. Land does not require that you confirm it exists or that it has been stolen, rather that you reciprocate the care it has given you. Now, the speaker for today, Dr. Sahana Ghosh, inaugurates the fourth year of a series of conversations that are committed to curating conversations on justice. Our Center for South Asian Studies focuses explicitly on justice, broadly defined, economic, feminist, aesthetic, environmental, and so much more within South Asia and the broader Indian Ocean world. We have worked very hard over the last few years to curate conversations that foreground and challenge continued histories of occupation, authoritarianism marked by caste, religion, gender, region, and of course, labor segmentation. At the heart of our struggle remains the enduring question of subaltern life worlds within which our collectivities survive, resist, and sometimes even surrender. I recall very poignantly that when we began, we dedicated our first session to the many voices of dissent that had been incarcerated under the current authoritarian government. And it is to my deep regret that my comrades in the Bhima Koregaon case, or someone like Omar Khalid, continues after over 1,000 days to remain in jail. So we stand in solidarity with them. I began with them. I continue with keeping those voices in mind as we forge our own conversations towards dissent and possibility. California, as many of you know, is also in a very unusual and privileged place right now. I, along with many comrades here, have been part of the campaign to pass SB 403, which of course will make California the first state to protect caste discrimination. And the bill is waiting on Governor Newsom's desk. To herald that moment, the Center for South Asian Studies will also be organizing a live concert with Arivu and the Ambassa Band on campus. It will be joyous, glorious, free, and full of possibilities. So if you are around the Bay Area, do join us. It's on October 7th at 8 p.m. in the beautiful UCSC Quarry. Now, without further ado, let me say a little bit about our series and, of course, more importantly, about our speaker. This year's series is entitled Crossings, to sort of speak more capaciously, not just about crossings as literal spaces, but also as epistemological, ethical, and political spaces of joining, surveillance, exchange, and transaction. And when I was conceiving this series along with some of my colleagues at the center, I couldn't think of anyone better than Sahana to begin and inaugurate this conversation for us. So let me turn now to say a little bit about Sahana, and then I will say a little bit about how we run the series. If this is the first time you've been here, I see lots of familiar faces, and I thank you for coming back and supporting our small and robust center. So officially, Sahana Ghosh, and I say officially because I've had the pleasure of learning and knowing Sahana for a very long time, and I am so delighted to see her new book in press, which I was hoping to show as my agitprop, but it has not arrived from UC Press yet. So officially, Sahana Ghosh is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the National University of Singapore. And because she loves me so much, she has very, very kindly agreed to stay up with us at this very late hour. So we have to make it worth her while. She does so much work, but I'll try and sort of bind it in a few words. She's broadly interested in forms and experiences of inequality produced through the intersection of mobility, policing, and gender in our contemporary world, and of course conducts research in India and Bangladesh. I use one of her pieces all the time where she coins this really sort of productive term called security socialities, a term that has been incredibly useful for me also to think about the infrastructures, civil, military, affective, to describe the kinds of relationships, particularly in India's eastern borderlands. Now, today, I think she's going to speak to us from her new fantastic and wonderful book, which is out from UC Press, called 1,000 Tiny Cuts: Mobility and Security Across the India-Bangladesh Borderlands, which chronicles, among many things, the slow transformation of a connected region into borderlands and shows the foundational place of gender and sexuality in relationship to security. This book is, I think, for me, a particularly significant intervention because it recasts the question of border fences and migrants, not just as border crossers, but rather speaks about it within the context of how a post-colonial state uses these bodies to materialize new forms of violence and devaluation. Now, before I turn it over to Sahana, just a few ground rules, not very many. One is we will, of course, mute you during Sahana's talk. We will, of course, unmute you once we're done. If you are feeling up to it, show us your lovely faces, because Zoom is such a weird form that for Sahana, it'd be wonderful, especially as we transition into question and answer, if she were to able to see who was in the audience. If you have a question, please send it to me in chat. And if you feel okay, I will call on you. If you don't feel okay about asking the question yourself, I will ask it for you. All right. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Sahana Ghosh. Radhika will spotlight Sahana now.
Thank you so much, Anjali, for this. First, for the invitation. It's a real honor, and I'm humbled to be in this series from which I've learned so much. I've, first, as she said, tuned in online when the series started, and it was a real welcome place to have conversations that I think were as much comfort as places to think through questions together for many of us during the pandemic. So it's a real honor. I'm very humble. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for this overly generous introduction. Thank you, Radhika, for organizing and setting up the music. It was we were playing a song by Moshumi Bhomik called Shankha Logu as we all logged in online. And thank you most of all to all of you who've tuned in. It's not as terrible a time as is for me. I definitely win that. It's 1:15 a.m. for me, but it's still you're sitting wherever you are listening to this talk. So thank you for making time. I'll keep my talk relatively short. I'll speak for about 35 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time to have a conversation together. Okay, so let me jump in to the topic of my talk today, which is the title is Searching for the Illegal Migrant Notes from the India-Bangladesh Borderlands. In mid-1992, before the Babri Masjid demolition, the Congress government in Delhi led Operation Pushback, an effort to identify, detain, and deport allegedly 3 million Bangladeshis from the city. That was the number bandied about at that time. In 2008, after bomb attacks in Jaipur, Rajasthan were allegedly linked to a Bangladeshi militant group, 116 Bengali Muslims were sent to judicial custody. Many, many more were rounded up, beaten by the city's cops, and of course evicted from the various urban settlements in which they live. In 2012, ABVP members dragged more than 100 migrant workers from Eastern India, both Bengali Muslim and Hindu, out of a Kerala-bound train near Bangalore, alleging that they were Bangladeshi infiltrators. They searched their possessions, frisked, checked their identity documents, and handed them over to the police. At that time, in 2012, I had begun doing field work in the borderlands of northern Bengal, and I vividly remember young men considering migrating on both sides, on both the Indian and Bangladeshi sides, considering migrating to different parts of India, discussing this incident. In 2017, a dispute over wages of a domestic worker in a posh gated housing complex in Noida led to hundreds of men and women losing jobs on the aspersion of being Bangladeshi. And 13 Bengali Muslim men were arrested on non-bailable warrants as they were charged under the Foreigners Act. As hashtag Malda in Noida trended on social media, and security guards required by domestic and other workers to enter these gated communities were revoked for 80 to 100 workers under the cry of, again, hashtag ban the Bangladeshi maid. Many of us at that time argued that border policing had indeed come loose from the barbed wire fence and security forces in the borderlands, and was squarely located in middle and upper middle class Savarna homes. The dust has not yet settled from the demolished homes in New Haryana for the Bengali Muslim migrant workers who've returned to their home districts in West Bengal and Assam just recently in August 2023. Farakka Express, the train on this route, they say was carrying over 200 such fellow workers, predominantly Muslim, but several Bengali Hindu too, and almost all with similar stories of wage and property theft. Now, I refer to this somewhat arbitrary selection of headlines over the last 30 years to remind us that the search for this figure, the search for the illegal immigrant, has long been among us in India, in our cities, saturating our eastern borderlands, and on the buses and trains in between. Sensational stories about forged documents regularly regale the Indian public, evoking fears about citizenship for sale and corrupt state agencies that has rendered all identity documents meaningless altogether, and thereby feeding demand and desire and kind of sanction, public sanction for more and more precise identification, as if that were possible. In fact, when I was doing the early years of my research during my PhD, when I was scanning decades of newspaper articles on this topic, one of my favorite sensational stories of this kind is that of a graveyard caretaker in Mumbai who was apparently and this is from the early mid-90s, who was apparently the mastermind of a national racket of forged identity documents, and this was reported across all Indian national newspapers. I remember reading at that time, this sounds like a character from an Arundhati Roy novel, but I digress. The main question I want to raise for us today is to think about not so much about these individual cases and what they have in common or not, but to really think about what political work this figure of the illegal immigrant accomplishes. Yeah, so what political work does this figure of the illegal migrant accomplish? The many ways in which this bogey figure enables a remaking of citizenship in contemporary India is the subject of much debate. Legal scholars, civil rights activists, ethnographers, various communities are doing really important work in documenting the different ways in which the remaking of citizenship is unfolding in legislative terms, in experiential terms, in different sites and locales and scales across the subcontinent, and also in mobilizing in many ways to confront, document, and counter this violent onslaught in India today. Indeed, I too have joined some of these conversations by showing the policing of these categories of citizen and foreigner go well beyond the presence or absence of documents, which in many ways is a, we fetishize and fixate on that, but the possession or absence of documents is no guarantee, but rather the figure of the illegal immigrant, I find in my ethnographic research in the borderlands at a number of different sites, at the border, in district courts, in annual revisions of electoral rolls, goes well beyond the state to conscript a wide set of actors into what can become this infinite search, right? So they're everywhere. Who are they? We don't know. We keep looking, right? So it's a promissory, infinite search. And while Assam and urban centers occupy the limelight in this, such policing and searching has saturated the Bengal borderlands for decades. And I can talk more about this kind of policing, this kind of dispersed policing in multiple registers in the Q&A if it is of interest, but I will not speak of this today. Instead, I want to take you to the Bengal borderlands and tell you a different kind of story about how this search for the illegal migrant is a form of bordering in a regional political economy of the borderlands that stretch across India and Bangladesh. In other words, this is not an India story alone. As Moushumi Bhaumik's song so poignantly reminds us, a minority here is a majority there. Here and there are necessary conditions of each other, intimately connected relations of value. So what is the force of this figure in the borderlands of India and Bangladesh, and why does this view of and from the borderlands matter? In my recently published book that Anjali so kindly mentioned, called 1,000 Tiny Cuts, the story of bordering I try to tell takes the border to be not a fixed thing in time, space, or structure, but instead I take bordering to mean an ongoing, very much an ongoing and historically layered cutting through which physical, social, political, and mental landscapes are remade. Drawing on a decade of fieldwork of ethnographic fieldwork in the borderlands of Bangladesh and India, in northern Bengal, the region that was formerly the princely state of Kuch Bihar, and actually historically a region of multiple borders. The book tells the story of bordering in multiple domains of life, and the kind of tries to trace the scatter of this bordering across these domains of life. Agrarian cultivation, in marriages, kinship relations across generations, rural spaces, and ordinary paths in border villages, and especially in the coming of age of young men, among others. And that's the aspect that I'll focus on today. I've learned over this decade of research in the borderlands that bordering is devaluing and productive in all kinds of ways. The Indian Border Security Force and the Bangladeshi border guards are only some of the actors, deeply invested and involved in surveilling clandestine mobilities. Neighbors are policing each other, all the time as well. Over this a decade, I began to see how borderland residents were identifying themselves and remaking their lives and relations according to several distinctions that the border affords. The border is a risk and a resource. On days when the price of crops is high and the price of meat was low, and when both countries were winning cricket matches, I even heard farmers describe this as the best of both worlds. But most of the time, neither the national domain of India nor Bangladesh offers much in isolation. Rather, the border generates a series of devaluations that hold India and Bangladesh together interdependently through a relationship, a hierarchical relationship of value. In popular imaginaries, borderlands are lawless places, criminal havens. In India and Bangladesh, equally, this imaginary is evident in media discourses and mainstream social perceptions. College, for instance, college students in hostels in Lalmonirhat and Rangpur, which are sort of big towns in the border districts in northern Bangladesh, were mocked if their friends found out that they came from border villages in those districts. Numerous times I've seen residents asked about their hidden wealth by co-passengers in public transportation when their destination was revealed to be, those border villages that they're traveling to in Bangladesh. And of course, I found this criminalizing imaginary acutely present among the border security and law enforcement agents, personnel posted in the borderlands on both sides. So, repeatedly, a kind of discourse I heard on both sides of the border in India and Bangladesh is that this is a place that the good leave. Good boys leave. They leave to marry. They leave to seek brides and family, make kinship relations further inward. They leave to find jobs elsewhere. They leave to study, inside. They leave the borderlands. So today I want to turn our attention to these young men, right? They're back to the putative, who are the illegal migrants being vilified or being presumed, figured, gendered, and sexualized in particular ways through the figure of the illegal migrant. And I want to turn our attention to young men, Muslim and Rajbongshi, coming of age against this political canvas and this impossible task of sorting citizens out from migrants and refugees. And really center their experiences and analyses. Young men come of age in these borderlands, navigating livelihood options amid stringent policing of male bodies and simultaneously the pressures of productive masculinity. If I can refer to the picture I used on the poster for my talk, it's that of a group of teenage boys on the cusp of adulthood, finishing high school, and standing on the Bangladesh side at an unfenced area, looking towards India on the horizon, particularly at a path used by daily wage workers who go from Bangladesh to work in fields on the Indian side, and looking at them as they're coming back. Hanging out by this unfenced part of the border, reveling in the openness of the horizon and the simultaneous closure of India in the distance in this picture, but often in Bangladesh, if the picture is taken from the other side. I frequently found young men, circling around profound questions of identity. What if I were Indian and not Bangladeshi? What if I had stayed on in my Mamar Bari, my maternal uncle's house on the other side, and taken up residence or made that my adopted home? These are very real questions and possibilities. And I have many variations of this kind of image. On the Indian side, looking out towards Bangladesh with teenage men, with mixed age groups. So growing up in the agrarian borderlands, young men come to be gendered, classed, and nationalized subjects within a social, economic, and political context marked by a profound sense of marginality and tremendous violence, particularly directed at male migrants. Such a context is a transnationally produced one. They are not only a rural youth, marginal within their respective national contexts, they grow up also acutely aware of their relative prospects in comparison to their peers across the national difference. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Rural and working class male migrants are cast as a threat to the cities and nation's modernity in India and Bangladesh. while the Bengali Muslim becomes the prototype of the border crossing illegal migrant in mainstream Indian discourse. Let me dig a bit deeper into this claim about bordering in and from the borderlands with two portraits. First, Alom. Alom Hussain is one of those who've not left, right? So if you think of this discourse I just told you about the good leaving the borderlands, Alom Hussain is one of those who've not left. In his words, we have to try our chances here. Lekha Pora, education, is not for people like us. We neither have any patron nor that much money that we can buy a job. Only education will not fill up your stomach. We have to keep trying here. Being scared will get you nowhere. You have to use your brains and understand how things work in this world. So Alom thus philosophizes and dwells on the ends and means of education for unconnected poor, rural poor like himself, while we talk in near his family's home in a village I call Bibiganj in northern Bangladesh. He was the black sheep in his family, or so he was presented to me by the rest of his the family. His older brother Ashraf ran a small pan shop just by the betel nut shop, just by the auto stand in the village, and he kept phones with Indian SIMs that people could use to make and receive calls for a small charge. I had been directed to his services once when my Indian SIM card was not working when I was living on the Bangladesh side, and we had struck up a lively friendship. I would, go often to sit at this shop and chat. Now, Ashraf Bhai had never left the greater Rangpur, northern Bangladesh area of northern Bangladesh, but he rattled off names of northern Indian places with much elan. They were not very well-known towns. Indeed, I didn't recognize many of the names. Ashraf Bhai explained that the callers on his Indian phones were men from Bibiganj, living as migrant workers in these places. They would call to speak to or leave messages for their family members. As I got to know Ashraf, these two brothers, Ashraf Bhai always spoke of his young brother Alom apologetically, saying that he wasn't doing so well. Ashraf Bhai was determined to persuade Alom to leave Bibiganj and head to Delhi, which is this catch-all term for destinations in northern India, with one of the many good contacts he had developed through his phone business. One evening he held up a small, now these old-fashioned small Nokia phones, blue Nokia phones in his hand, and he said, "My friend in Shiliguri has been there for so long that he has become a labor contractor there now. He has a 2-story house. He's all settled there. He tells me repeatedly that I can call him anytime and send Alom. He's given his word to take care of him, no matter what the risks are." But Alom was not going to be sent thus, clandestinely crossing the border to India. It was when I finally got time chatting with him at a distance from his family home and these judgments, that no sooner than I had broached what his brother's designs and asked him what he thought of it, he lashed out in protest. And I quote Alom, "Why go to do Bideshe Golami? Or serve in another country when I can do something here? If I must take dunya jhuki, all kinds of risks, I might as well take them here, sitting in my own home." The jhuki, the risk he was referring to, I later learned was ferrying Gaja along with passengers in his auto, for which he had been caught and served a short time in jail. But nonetheless, undaunted, Alom firmly placed such risks and gains in this comparative frame. Alom's pragmatism about the economic prospects in and of the borderlands rang out sharply in comparison to the prospects of what he called servitude, Bideshe Golami, in another country. The borderlands of India and Bangladesh are full of Aloms. It's a place that the young with promise leave, and therefore the young who remain are, by that circular logic, popularly held to be bokhate or rotten or wasted by both state and social, in kind of social discourses and perception. The burden of this alleged dangerous criminality located in the space of the rural borderlands rests squarely on the shoulders of young men like Alom. Those who remain or return, like others I write about, and try to eke out a living in these agrarian borderlands, become the prime targets of security forces and law enforcement agencies, the BSF in India and the BGB and district police in Bangladesh. Now, discourses of contagion and criminality are not disembodied, right? They manifest in eminently gendered categories of intervention. So alongside the figure of the illegal migrant that is so, dominant in the political discourse in India, the bokhate chele, or the wasted man or boy, is one such gendered figure and a figure of tremendous anxiety in Bangladesh. In this discourse about the bokhate chele, Indian drugs coming across the border are not only targeting youth, Bangladeshi youth with addiction, but also turning them into criminals. Nation-centered analyses make this connection very clear, spatializing the borderlands as dangerous and borderland youth, particularly borderland young men, as simultaneously vulnerable and dangerous. In northern Bangladesh, when I was living there in 2015, a 15-year-old girl boldly asked the superintendent of police of the district of Lalmonirhat, this borderline district, and I quote, there are a lot of drug addicts in our society and there are a lot of drug sellers in these borderlands. How do we stop them? The superintendent was in her school that day as part of a drive to reform vulnerable youth, in which the district police was reaching out to students in high schools, colleges, and madrasas, to a hall full of about 100 schoolgirls in the age group of 14 to 18. He described a familiar type of social miscreant, the bokhate chele, and I take this term from this campaign. The bokhate chele, the SP described, and I quote, "He resembles a dog with heavy chains and bracelets around his neck and wrists. He has streaks of color in his spiky gelled hair, cigarette in his fingers or dangling out of the corner of his mouth as he stands leaning sideways, sometimes fashionably. That's the bokhate chele standing right outside your school, on your route back home, trying to impress you. They usually take drugs. Often they have some drugs on them, Indian drugs, selling them. I usually beat them up when I catch them. After that, sending them to court only means that they will get out on bail or by giving money. So I shame them. Sometimes I even call their parents and shame them and their parents together." He went on to boast that his team, instructed to show no mercy towards such corrupted youth, such bokhate chele, had quite a record to show of the many they had caught. And then he appealed to these schoolgirls, saying, "Now I need your help to catch more of these bokhate chele. We have to do this for a better society, for our country. It's a matter of national security." So the police chief's invitation encouraged the students, all drawn from either Lalmonirhat town or surrounding border villages, to fix their gaze towards their peers, their brothers, their neighbors, in this criminalizing fashion. And his contention that they would have to be reformed with deterring violence if necessary echoes almost exactly the kind of language and very material tactics used by Indian counterparts in the border security force. So policing and reforming borderland men and deviant, and especially in this kind of deviant masculinity, one's not engaged in proper productive work and behavior, and the invitation to vigilant citizenship within the borderlands taps and reproduces, entrenches a normative language about a proper heteropatriarchal social order that scales from the rural borderland neighborhood to the national body politic, right? It's made a matter of national security. Portrait 2, Shobhuj was 22 when I first met him a while ago. He's the third of 7 brothers in a Muslim family with very little land. In a village I call Kathalbari on the Indian side of the borderlands in the district of Cooch Behar. When I asked him what he and his older brothers did, he said, "Babsha kore, do business." His glance clearer than his words. In his words, he described how he got involved. "I was 15 and I was still studying in school," recalled Shobhuj, of his first foray into this business. "I didn't ask for it. One night, my brother, who works in the cattle business, couldn't go, and he sent me as his replacement. I had to transport a pair of cows all the way up to the border. I came home at dawn with cash in my hands. That's how I got entangled." Shobhuj's parents are elderly. His 2 older brothers who have married must now stay engaged in the border's economies to earn enough cash to keep their households running. One of them, who had been, who was very reluctant to speak to me, all he, would say is that in Bengali he said, "বউয়ের লিপস্টিকের জন্য বাবার কাছে হাত পাততে পারবো না," which I would translate as, sort of explaining why he keeps doing this very risky work of participating in the cattle economy, is that I can't ask my father for money to buy my wife a lipstick. Keenly aware of how cash flows from the Dunamburi border, from this kind of clandestine border economy, and the transition to being a householder with financial responsibilities can become entangled, Shobhuj remarked to me several times that he did not want to marry until he had found a stable source of income for himself. One afternoon, I accompanied Shobhuj and his friends as they bought their goods, cosmetics for one of them and a large carton of Lay's potato chips for the other, from wholesalers in Dinhata border town, that they were going to transport across the border to their partners in the adjacent Bangladeshi border village. As we returned to Kathalbari, to the Indian border village, he reflected on his work and he said, "What I do is petty business. I don't have the capital for anything bigger than this." And then he joked, "If I could only go up to a bank and say, 'Give me a loan for my group place,' that would really solve all my problems." His friends knew that I was well acquainted with the women's self-help groups of the region. And so, they all chimed in saying, yes, why don't you come with us and help us get a loan? Amrao Shonirbhor hote chai. We also want to be self-reliant. Their joke referred to a darling of the developmental world that I'm sure many, all of you are familiar with, the microfinance model of women's self-help groups that receive loans for individual or group enterprises. While much has been written about this, of course, in both India and Bangladesh, as providing capital to women to encourage small-scale enterprises and for their financial independence. By focusing exclusively on women, it puts rural men entirely outside the system of financial networks. Across the borderlands, young men compared the differences they learned about between credit systems in India and Bangladesh, and the ways in which these impacted gender norms, family relations, and women's expectations, families' expectations of men. Later on, Shobhuj continued to share, his account and analyses of how he's made these kinds of decisions for himself. And I quote, "I don't like this business of credit and debt, of transporting commodities, small commodities, across to Bangladesh and leaving those unpaid for. It's very complicated to recover money from Bangladesh because my networks are not so strong. So I only do straightforward transactions, chocolates, chips, creams, all in small quantities. But that limits me because that, it's going to, by which he meant that it would take a very long time for him to accumulate the capital he wanted in order to quit these to have a more stable business, which he imagined to be opening up a shop." He continued, "A boy got shot in the arm right next to me while we were swimming across the river. to Bangladesh in the darkness of the night with plastic-wrapped bundles of ganja. That boy is still living with pieces of shrapnel in his arm. Gesturing to the back of his arm, Shobuj looked past me as he, remembered this incident. This happened 2 winters ago, and I became afraid. I became very afraid of my life. So I stopped the business of the night that he'd, been initiated into several years ago by his older brothers. Now I only do this small stuff. After about a year of such petty business, Shobuj concluded it was just not profitable enough to provide the necessary capital, and he would have to seek such income elsewhere. The allure of this kind of cash, ready cash, is tremendous for teenage boys and young men in the borderlands. On either side, you could easily spot a boom. Seasonally during the monsoons, or when specific commodities were in demand, or when a particular route was open. And you could spot this by groups of energetic boys in new jeans and sunglasses, hanging out in cool music or gadget shops of the village markets. But while this cash belittled as easy money, buys some of the accoutrements of youth masculinity and allows them to be stylish for a while, it seldom consolidates a transition towards more responsible, more stable, productive masculinity, which is, of course, what has social status. Booms eventually bust, and no sooner than these young men and their households start enjoying the cash, they are without any. And so after trying their hand in various businesses of the border economy, in a context where farming is really just neither profitable nor remotely attractive to these young people, young men often decide to take on the risks of migration. The Indian BSF understood the temporality of this economic desperation really well and weaponize it in their strategies. In other words, they intend their security practices to be violent enough to make it too risky for young men to remain engaged in these border businesses. So Shobuj's portrait of decision-making around livelihoods makes very clear that Delhi and the borderlands are connected economies with money and multiple forms of value flowing in both directions. People earn in one to invest or further interests in another. Risk is embodied, risk is seasonal, risk is a feature of work in Delhi, as much as risk is a daily calculation in farming and businesses afforded by the border. Shobuj refused, one thing that was really noticeable and I think important to note is that Shobuj refused to answer my questions about fun in the city. I kept asking, I would ask him and others what they did in their free time in the city, giving the impression that no part of his experience as a migrant was enjoyable. Indeed, in both India and Bangladesh, I found that migration was lauded by very few, whether it was, within India to different cities, within Bangladesh, or across the border. New and veteran migrants across the borderlands emphasize that migration was risky. Mobility for young men is risky, here or there, in the majority, and especially as a minority. Other scholars of mobility have also talked about the way in which migrants remain stretched across multiple places. For Bengali Muslims, this stretching is fraught and exhausting, and needs to be understood a bit specifically, as borderland Bengali migrants, both Indian and Bangladeshi, are repeatedly attacked in locales across India with allegations of being illegal migrants and their vulnerability exploited. Their identities are collapsed into the Bengali Muslim figure, even as internal differentiations, especially that of nationality, sharpen even more, right? Rather than solidarity is growing within this kind of collapsed category of figure. So bordering establishes a relationship between risk and value. In devaluing some spaces and some bodies, it makes risks possible. Shob dike jhuki ache. This is a refrain I heard over and over again. There's risk in every direction. Young men shared this repeatedly, a conclusion, a lament, an angry critique, and expectation. For instance, the riskier it is to cross the border to transport goods or cattle, the more profitable it is in immediate terms of cash payouts. In another calculus, with increased border security and militarized violent border security, it is too risky to cross the border often, and so men may choose to stay away from the borderlands and take other risks to defer border crossing, which includes the risk of continuing to be subject to these kinds of violent, being the target of violent xenophobic discourses in various parts of India and Bangladesh. Across the world, those who work in what are branded as illegal or clandestine networks are widely considered to be criminals in statist and socio-legal terms. In North Bengal, it's the gendered criminalization of the borderlands and its young men as either smugglers or criminals or predatory migrants in cities that invites the violence of militarized policing into what is resolutely, continues to be described as a friendly border, right, by both India and Bangladesh. The lens of security, whether adopted by the state or by national publics, seek to fix risk and danger in the mobile bodies of borderland men, in the case of Northern Bengal, lower caste, Muslim, and laboring. I invite you to take a step back and consider this very lens itself as an ongoing and expansive process of bordering. The view can reveal the deep cuts such bordering makes and how it normalizes the more spectacular violence directed at the much maligned figure of the illegal migrant. So let's look back to the question I started with, which is, what is the political work that the figure of the illegal migrant accomplishes? Residents on both sides of the borderlands face very similar structural disadvantages, though they experience them, of course, quite differently. For example, I'll give you two very poignant but very material visual examples. For example, the halogen lights set up by India along its border fence only shine in one direction, drawing insects. In many parts, it draws insects to the banana fields owned by Bangladeshi farmers, on the other side, and destroys them, right? So it makes it kind of devalues not just the price and value of the land, but makes it impossible to farm those lands as well. As a young man in Madhupur, village on the Bangladesh side pointed out wryly to me once, referring to the rifles of the Indian BSF trained towards Bangladesh, and in his emphasis towards Bangladeshis, the mouth of the gun faces only in one direction. When I suggested to him that it's not that different what what you face, what you experience on both sides of the border. So even when borderland residents share experiences, residents are separated by distinctions and hierarchies of national identity, and these very material, these very kind of materialized practices, and seldom make common cause. And this search for the illegal migrant, we can begin to see how that is an eminently nationalizing and fracturing discourse as well. National frames come in between, fracturing possible transnational solidarities, and that's perhaps the deepest cut of bordering. The gendering and nationalizing of bodies interwoven produce the very hierarchical relations of value through which bordering unfolds. Whether of men and women as daily wage workers, of India and Bangladesh themselves as separated markets and economies, or of Bengali Muslim masculinity and mobility as a national security threat, counterposed, right, contradistinct from the vulnerability of Bengali Hindu women, whose clandestine mobilities can then be, legitimized or considered permissible. So in my, in the sort of larger arc of the book, bordering, the story I tell, bordering does not simply have an effect on gendered bodies and relations, but bordering itself is a transnational and hierarchical relation of value that becomes concrete through a range of gendered mobilities and immobilities. At perhaps at a larger, in the larger picture, at a bigger scale, my account of bordering, what I hope to achieve in a way is to de-exceptionalize borderlands and its residents. Because they're central, I see them as central to the formation of the national, right? A relation, this kind of unexplained qualifier, self-evident qualifier that attaches itself to security, to identity, to economy, and to territory. These multiple and tiny cuts of bordering are ongoing and have birthed national borderlands as particularly disconnected and remote spaces. Their residents and these spaces, separated and nationalized by the end of the 20th century, are suitably underdeveloped to be reframed as threatening sites of national security, needing the militaristic and developmental attention of their respective states to be properly settled, to be properly bordered. In October 2021, for instance, the Indian government declared that the jurisdiction, what is classified as the border area, is to be and therefore the remit of the Indian Border Security Force would be extended to areas up to 50 kilometers from the existing 15 from India's international borders. Overnight, the entire district of Cooch Behar and several others in eastern India became designated borderlands, right? Sites of national security. Meanwhile, in Bangladesh, since the exchange of enclaves in this in 2015 in this region, in this part of northern Bangladesh, the state has been actively incorporating land and people into the fold of the national, right? Saturating this part of Bangladesh with intensive presence, state presence, and all kinds of state surveillance that actually reinforce the borderness of these borderlands, right? So back to the police chief's comments about how the borderlands are a particularly vulnerable site for national security and national integrity. A story told from the borderlands shows most clearly how political economic questions of land, resources, and the exploitation of labor are rooted through the lens of national security regimes in both India and Bangladesh, and especially across India and Bangladesh. The cuts of bordering separate in ways and debilitate such that solidarities are hard to imagine, even when we try and grasp and counter this discourse of the illegal migrant. With these developments, that I've just sort of referred to, it's ever more urgent to take a transnational approach to examine the political construction of the male migrant as a security threat and a locus of national anxiety in ways that allow us to reimagine the connected politics of migrant illegality across the region and perhaps reframe the terms in which this discourse is staged. Across a regional and looking at these issues, so looking at the figure of the illegal migrant from the perspective and from the view of borderlands shows that across a regional political economy, risk is nationalized, even as the pressures of masculine becoming in a distressed agrarian world are interwoven with the risks introduced by militarization. Depeasantization, migration, and immobility are structural and material conditions that were constituted transnationally across these borderlands. We must recognize our transnationally constituted national categories in order to imagine more just, redistributive, and entirely anti-national ways of being in relation to one another. I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience and for listening so attentively. I look forward to your questions, comments, in a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Sahana. I would ask people who are here, if you feel comfortable, to turn on your video so that Sahana, who is in Singapore, can experience your love from afar. There are a few people who have messaged me to ask questions. I'll call on them in a minute, but I'm going to take my moderator's privilege to open up the conversation a little bit, if I may, Sahana. Firstly, I am yet to read your book. I have been waiting impatiently for it to be delivered, but I have had the pleasure of hearing you talk about this issue over the years, and it's been wonderful to see it get more and more complicated. So my question is about a tension that I heard today, and I'm sure it's worked out more eloquently in the book, which is your call to think about this idea of the borderland or bordering as a material epistemology that's not sequestered in the regions that you're thinking about, but at the same time, the geopolitical form, which is the Bangladesh-India border, that produces a very unique set of bordering value economies, right? So that's a tension which I think is very generative. But the reason I'm asking you to say more about it, if you feel up to it, is it also produces this question of the intra and extra migrant question, right? So Bangladesh has migrants from Myanmar/Burma, Rohingya, etc. So they have their own bordering infrastructure. India has Bangladesh, but it also has Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, etc. Right? So I wanted to get a sense of the intra-extra, right? Like, how is this wonderful, I think, call that you're making to say, what can we learn from this epistemology of bordering, right? How can it help us pass out this tension between the material epistemological form and then the geopolitical, which is, very particular. So whatever you fancy, and then I'll turn to the other people. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Very, very well spotted, and thank you for inviting me to say a little bit more about this. I'll try to be as coherent as I can. I should also say, on a different, slightly personal note, that my very first conference in the US, when I moved to the US to begin my PhD, was to UCSC at a conference that had been hosted and organized by Anjali. So it's very feels kind of like a somewhat of an odd shape path to have this conversation here now. So I wouldn't say it's a tension. I would say what the book describes and what the book tries to do, what my analysis, what my account tries to do, is actually connect these two, what you're describing as the intra and the extra, right? The story of the very particular historical, material story of the India-Bangladesh borderlands with these others, right, that are not talked of in the same frame, what you're calling the geopolitical. And I think, and the way in which I see this happening, I think it's very important to connect them, both politically and for analytical reasons, which is that, while at this, often the story of this border, we could tell the story of this border as an India militarizing its side of the border and, kind of subjecting a regime of militarized violence on Bangladeshis, right? That's absolutely correct. But that would be to keep ourselves, to stop at one part of the story, right? So Bangladesh, is absolutely participating in this, as I've given you a sense of in this talk today, in this at the India-Bangladesh border in a kind of national security regime and discourse of its own, but it's also participating in the very same discourse of migrant illegality and militarized bordering on its border with Myanmar, for instance, right? So while India's border security regime at the India-Bangladesh border is not constructed in isolation in relation to Bangladesh alone, but in contradistinction to its presence and its regime on the Pakistan border, right? So very often I would hear, and I write about this, the Indian BSF saying, but this is a friendly border, this is not Kashmir, we're just beating them up and letting them go, but because this is a friendly border and it's a friendly country, it's not Kashmir. If this was Kashmir, we'd be shooting them. We can't shoot them because this is a friendly border, right? We have to use and since a Supreme Court order in 2011, they use they have a restraint on the order to shoot on site, and they carry these pellet guns, which of course are very terrible, as we know from Kashmir, and now we're watching unfold in Manipur. So what I mean to say is that I think if we lift our frame of analysis and we tune into the way in which the specific story of border security and bordering in the India-Bangladesh borderlands is not only constructed in relation to one another, but for both India and Bangladesh, constructed geopolitically in relation to their other experiences of bordering, right? And in none of those frames is that, does that temper the kind of bordering, but rather it's a demand for more militarized bordering, more this promise of more effective, and what fills the figure of the illegal migrant changes, but the discourse kind of circulates from particular locale to another, if that's a kind of start.
Thank you. I think that's helpful, and I think when I read your book, I will learn more from this conversation. We have plenty of people who are waiting to ask questions. A couple of people who had to leave that have asked me to ask their question, but I'll hold them to the end and first turn to my colleague Nidhi Mahajan. Then I have Junaid Sheikh, and then I have Sharvari. So Nidhi, you're on.
Hi, thank you, Sahana. I'm so excited to read the book, having followed your work for a while now. And perhaps this is actually following on what you just responded with Anjali in terms of thinking about, the India-Bangladesh border together with sort of the Kutch-Sindh border is what I'm thinking about. And I'm thinking especially of and this might be in the book, but I'm just, curious to learn more because it's something I've been thinking about recently. But in terms of sort of thinking about the Kutch-Sindh border and Farhana Ibrahim's work, especially where the figure of the Bengali Muslim woman is kind of brought in to fix kind of problems about mobility on the border. I really, enjoyed this kind of thinking through the gendered figure of the illegal male migrant, but how is also the Bengali Muslim female migrant gendered in these mobilities or immobilities, right? What does that actually look like in terms of, many of these men are articulating a desire to move to also marry. So what are those configurations of marriage and mobility actually? What do they look like? Who do these people end up marrying? And what are the women who stay at home or leave? What does that configuration look like? Because I think marriage is actually at the heart of some of these mobilities and immobilities. So I'm just curious to sort of learn more. Yeah.
Absolutely. Fabulous. Thank you, Nidhi. I couldn't say it better. Marriage is absolutely at the heart of a lot of, when cross-border marriages is a ubiquitous form of gendered mobility in this region, and it's very much a part. So again, in thinking in terms of the ways in which mobilities in relation to one another are constructed at different scales, right? So if the bordering at the India-Bangladesh border is kind of compared, it's not a Kashmir, it's not Pakistan, it's not Myanmar. The mobilities of young men are, criminalized or are cast as particularly threatening in relation to the mobilities of women who cross, who clandestinely cross this border to marry, and more often to keep up with kin relations, right? So, every other family, probably every family across these border villages, this agrarian borderland has kin relations on either side. And not only did they not stop and slowly peter out with over the decades. One of the chapters of the book is about cross-border marriages and kinship relations across generations. And so what I trace in that story, what I found to be quite remarkable, actually, that if one traces the kind of mobilities by following women's crossings to keep up, to see family, cross-border marriages over generations, we don't, the biography of the border changes from being this the standard political history we're all familiar with, which is 47, and then it was all open, 71 war, all open. India opened the border to host millions of refugees, and then a slow but certain march towards closure. That's not the political, that's not the biography of the border we get at all. But it's a much more marriages and cross-border marriages and kin relations tell a much more variegated and very different history of closures and openings, right? Where different political milestones emerge. And the point really is, and I'll just say it very bluntly, which is that women's clandestine crossings to see family of both Muslim and certainly Hindu women, Rajbongshi in this area, are still permissible. Are still the security forces will still turn kind of look away and allow it to happen in certain kinds of ways. And when not permitted, there is huge social criticism of the state in ways that are just not, and that in ways that women themselves reproduce, right? That we're not like men crossing for border businesses, right? So gendered mobilities and immobilities are kind of, they produce one another. Certain kinds of mobility, gendered mobilities, that of women crossing for, and we see that so clearly even within families, right? That sons can't cross to, meet their mothers perhaps on the other side, but mothers or wives or, daughters can. And that creates all kinds of frictions and, tensions, fraught relations within families, within this transnational borderland family. So absolutely, they're very much defined in relation to one another.
Thank you, Sahana. That's Nidhi, thank you for that question. Also because it opens up an entire Pandora's box about, the sex worker, migrant communities that come out of Bangladesh, etc., which I will harass Sahana about anon, because we have so many other people waiting to ask questions. Junaid, you're up next.
Thank you so much, Sahana, for the talk. And I really, really enjoyed it. I love the way you paint a picture with your words about the border, etc. I had a couple of questions. One, of course, if you were to sit and talk with Alam and Shobuj and Ashraf, what does nation mean to them? Or is it a meaningful category for them? It is because they are nationalized subjects, etc. But nation and nationalism, what does it mean for them? And then another question, a slight different question, is about the drug economy that you were talking about, etc. What is that longer history of this drug economy in this region? I'm assuming it's not of the past 20, 30 years. It must be, goes back even longer. So if you have some, so if you can provide some more sense of this trajectory of the drug economy. Thank you.
Sure, a very fun question and a very profound question. Trust Junaid to, bring the right balance. Nation, so the Bengali word that people would use is desh and desher bari. And there's copious amounts of writing, by all kinds of Bengali scholars on desh and what this term means. So I won't rehearse that at all. But suffice it to say, and I actually really build on the work of another writer, anthropologist that who's been featured in the series, whose work I really admire and engage very closely, Shari Kathiranagama, who talks about how we shouldn't assume, and that's certainly I'm referring to her work because it's very resonant with what I find and also write about in my case. What I find is that we shouldn't assume the nation as a frame of reference for mobile, for mobile people and for mobile communities. And I found that the Desh would variously refer to a rural neighborhood, a village, and often in these mobilities, right? So again, the some of the people you read about in this book, or that I write about in this book, are migrants who moved from Bengali Muslims who moved at various points in the 50s. They exchanged homes to be, again, back to Moshumi Bhomik's song, they exchanged homes with Hindu residents in what became East Pakistan, with whom they were engaged in all kinds of, they knew them well. They were often traders, partners in trade in tobacco or jute or other. So they exchanged homes and property to move not very far, but to be on the right side of the border. So often these were very short distance mobilities and exchanges or resettlements, right? They moved maybe 5-10 kilometers to be on the right side of the border, but not to be very far away from where they were from, right? So this idea of Desh is very slippery also, because it can be your village, but it can also be your rural neighborhood, which is an area which actually goes across this border, because you continue to have kin, familial, all kinds of memories, relationships. Not all of which are romanticized, not all of which you are nostalgic for, some of which you are estranged from, right? So all this to say that I think part of bordering, part of people's relationships to bordering draws them into negotiating this question of, what is the unit, what is the spatial unit, what is the spatial point of reference to which I'm most at home, whether that's the neighborhood, whether that's the village, whether that's a national identity. So not nation and not nationalism, but I would say that's where the category of the national really, again, people learn that, right? So as I say, family members start to, have to learn to live as national neighbors, right? So between cousins, between sisters, between in-laws, right? They come to see themselves as Indian and Bangladeshi. Right. So those are national identities rather than ideas of, what nation means to them. So if that helps. The drug economies. So there are several of them. One of which I write about, ganja, is now, people joke that it's an export crop. Grown exclusively on the Indian side, grown on the Indian side exclusively now for, transporting to Bangladesh, where it can't be grown, but there's a huge demand for it. But of course, there's a long history to ganja was introduced and, not introduced, but ganja was widely grown in this region, actually, from the time of tea, the rooting of tea in this region. So, so both ganja and tobacco, various forms of edible tobacco, were rooted in this region in the early 20th century, and widely distributed, consumed by workers involved in both farm work and in plantations, to alleviate kind of the stresses of hard toil. So that there's that kind of history. But in the present form, ganja has grown very much kind of for Bangladesh. The other drug, which is the kind of bigger point of anxiety in Bangladesh, is fentanyl, is a cough syrup. So this, the Bokhate Chele that this SP, talks about, who's standing fashionably and has drugs and is selling drugs. It's really fentanyl. Everybody, it's a over-the-counter cough syrup in India, but it's the substance of the most abused substance in Bangladesh. Although fast replaced by yaba tablets coming from the northeastern borderlands and from Bangladesh's border with Burma. So, therein lies another story of competing geographies of drug. But so fentanyl is, and so there's this big discourse that India is kind of flooding us with fentanyl to attack and corrupt our youth, which is of course our national asset, and therefore attacking our national security. So fentanyl is the big kind of anxiety about addiction and about drug abuse in Bangladesh. I mean, you open a newspaper any day in Bangladesh, and there'll be at least 3 stories about the ingenious ways in which fentanyl is pouring into the country from all sides from India, and then the ingenious ways in which they're being smuggled to various cities and reaching Dhaka eventually. So those are some.
Thanks, Sahana. Thank you, Junaid, for that wonderful question as always. Sahana, if you're up for it, we have 4 people more who have questions, and then we'll call it a day. And if I could just urge the folks who have questions to keep them as sparklingly short as possible for Sahana to do justice to all of us. So first I have Sharvari, Darshana, Madhavi, and then we'll end with Mizan. Okay, Sharvari, you're up.
Hi, Sahana. Thank you so much for this talk. I was really struck when the first part of your talk where you described this figure of the male migrant youth as both this very fraught identity that's inhabited by people who live on the borderlands, but also to some extent like a stereotype, a caricature like this SP speech. And I was just curious to hear a little bit more about aging in this borderland, in the sense of you began with headlines that were at least 30 years old. So in a sense, is this a historical figure of this male migrant illegal youth? If so, how is it narrativized among your interlocutors? Which is all just to say, do you find that the public perception of this illegal young male migrant has changed, or is it like just something static? That's
fabulous question. Really, really fabulous question. And I have some thoughts, but I would love to think and talk more about this, about what you said at the end, the narrativization of this. So, 2 things to say. One, there's now, as I was mentioning, there's now at least a second generation, if not kind of a bit more, of men leaving from these regions, from this area, in all directions, across the border to various parts of India, various parts of Bangladesh, and there the narratives actually differ a little bit in how it's talked about, because labor migration is, of course, Bangladesh's kind of second biggest source of foreign, remittances. So they're Bangladesh's sort of second largest export next to garments. And so there's a very particular kind of national discourse around the labor migrant, but it's of a particular kind, right? So Bangladesh officially has always maintained that it has no illegal migrant in India. In India, on the Indian side, and actually I would say apart from that very particular international labor migration discourse in Bangladesh, stress migration. So there have been seasonal famines in this region of northern Bengal for decades. It used to be called Monga. Of course, improved irrigation, cropping for more than once a year has relieved that seasonal famine to a great extent. But out migration for reasons of food stress is a very old phenomena and a very, very, very sharp, vivid memory. So that's where I think the generational history and memory is very alive, where men remember, across generations, grandfathers, fathers, perhaps grandfathers were not migrant because there were not such economies to migrate to in either in India. That would have been pre-liberalization in India. there would not have been those kinds of economies to migrate to. But men all, so across generations, there's a vivid memory of leaving in search of any work that would either bring cash or often food, right? And often kind of earlier generations talk about men migrating for farm work in other parts of India or other parts of Bangladesh, right? Before these kinds of other forms of construction, manufacturing industries came up. So there is, and by the time we come to this, the Aloms and the Shobujas of today, no one talks about migration as, so this kind of discourse we have about migration as a rite of passage, migration as, a lure of the city, that's just not present in these areas at all, right? And I think it's not just this generation experience, but it's an accumulation of this experience over time. How this is narrativized in relation to the figure of the illegal migrant, Sharvari, I think is something I have to, think a little bit more about. But I think that's a very, very important question, for sure.
Thank you, Sharvari. Darshana, you're up next. Darshana, unmute yourself.
I can't hear you.
Okay, why don't you sort out your sound and I'll turn to Madhavi next. Madhavi, go for it.
Thank you. Sahana, is so wonderful to see you, even though I wish it was not middle of the night for you. And thank you for this very, very generative talk. So actually, my question is perhaps a supplement to Sharvari's question. I was just very intrigued and fascinated by your to use Junaid's terms, your evocative kind of painting of the figure, right? The figuration of this young masculinity, the illegal migrant, both and it reminded me of both in its caricatured form, as represented by that SP's, discourse, but also in some of what you were narrating, drawing on these young men's own words. It reminded me of another caricature, which is the Tapori figure. This youthful masculinity, streaked hair, kind of, that young women are told to guard themselves against, right? Maybe the carrier of, drugs and other kinds of corrupting influences, right? The way that, in the SP's discourse, the body language of that illegal migrant, the Tapori figure is, of course, a very urban figure, right? So I was just wondering, I mean, if you've thought about or are planning to think about the genealogies and the trajectories of this figuration, and how it circulates. And then a corollary to that, because it also then reminds me of yet another figure, the British working class lad, right? And their stylization, right, of by again drawing on all kinds of different sources. So was there something in these young men? I mean, is there a kind of agentful stylization of a particular kind of masculinity that might be speaking? I mean, so this is another way to get at the transnational, right? I was thinking, through these different narrative trajectories.
Yeah, that's so that's a lovely connection to think in relation to the Tapori types and other, and as you put it, the more playful, agentful elements to this. And I'll try and I'm still thinking of Sharvari's question, so I'll try and say a bit more to in response to both of you. So I think for these young men, many of them, and if you see if the picture I use even on the poster, there's of course it's not surprising or unusual that there is a certain styling going on for young men, right? Now, what happens though in the border and the backdrop, quite literally, right? The staging, where can they go to take pictures of themselves and post on Facebook or take videos on TikTok, right? The sites, the places to go to are the border, right? It's not the fence, but it's other. It's there various parts, picturesque sites, right? Like the unfenced river, but particularly spots where it can be an India in the background, in the background, sort of on the horizon, and you're standing on the Bangladesh side, or vice versa, right? So the physical geography of the place quite literally provides the kind of canvas for a certain styling to happen. And I haven't, this is not something I've done very methodically, but Facebook for a very long time was, and still is to a certain extent, the only reason I haven't deactivated my account altogether is that a lot of these young folks still, we message each other on Facebook still. Facebook is a site where, people would take, these young folks would take pictures of themselves and post each other and befriend each other, right? So they communicated and shared in a kind of aesthetic, not just of dress, but really of the site, the borderland as a site of more, of staging, of style and fashion around times around Eid, where, groups of, not just the daily by the evening, like at the pretty time of sunset or, dusk, when the colors of the sky are just stunning. But Eid or other kinds of, or somebody's birthday, right? So they to take a motorbike, to take a motorcycle and, pose all around it, and that kind of fashioning. But where do they get the money for that from? Right. So that's kind of what comes back in a way to the desire for certain clothes or smartphones or gadgets, or to look a certain way, to stage a certain image of oneself, requires making these kinds of very complicated decisions about where one is to get that money from. And more and more what's happening, and this is, perhaps a way to connect to Sharvari's question, a change over generations is that kind of dressing for young men in the borderlands has become a marker. It kind of outs them to security forces and law enforcement agencies as suspicious, because where have they got the money? If they are, in the borderlands and hanging around dressed up, they can be up to no good. That's basically the reading, right, of those markers, in a way that was not, Sharvari, to your question, in a way that was not for a previous generation, right? So I would say policing practices and bordering by these markers of dress, right, of comportment, of body language, that has changed. And that's very similar on both sides. So, another kind of aesthetic practice, and I'll just end with that, that you guys are making me think of to connect with, and I write about that a little bit, is that initially I would watch the Bangladesh district police do this on Facebook, and now the BSF does this routinely, and I have like a ever increasing archive of Facebook posts and tweets where they catch a young man with a consignment of fentanyl, like bottles of fentanyl or ganja, and they stage that. So there'll be the police on either side, like literally an old, the template of the old shikari picture is how I think of it, right? So they'll display the seized goods and the man, and most cases young, youthful, but not always. Sometimes they're older men too, but they'll be figured in that picture, literally with a placard of what they've been caught with, what their name is, what village they're from. So there is, there are kind of visual way. There are all kinds of ways in which visual markers out young men and then are used to kind of shame them for that kind of flaunting as well. Like you thought you had this bravado, you were doing this, we've caught you and we're going to display you in a particular kind of way, right? That's of this generation, I would say. That is of the last 20 odd years, this kind of policing, this kind of framing of the illegal migrant figure or the smuggler or the criminal. Shawari, it was not, as pointed, which is not to say that there weren't other kinds of policing before.
Thank you, Sahana. I want to be very mindful that we've exhausted you, but there is so much excitement about your work.
But now I'm waking up. And
I'm going to request Darshana and Mizan, if it's okay, if you could ask your questions one after the other, and then we'll let Sahana answer them. Sahana, there are also a lot of questions in the chat, and we will have them available to you afterwards so you can think about them as well. So Darshana, why don't you ask your question, then I will have Mizan ask their question, and Sahana, you can end by answering both as you feel. All right, Darshana, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anjali. Sahana, congratulations on the book. It's always like brilliant to actually think about your work in progress. And, I think the first presentation we had it together at the conference Anjali organized. So it's always nice to see how the work has developed over years. So my question is again going back to the idea of state terminology of internal migrants, and I'm curious to know a little bit about the people from border village entering into spaces like Kerala, because I've done some fieldwork there, and the category of Bangladeshi/Bengali has become like a state vocabulary used for categorization. So I'm interested in also knowing about how there is a slippage in this idea of who Bengali is, who Bangladeshi is as internal migrants enter into other geographical spaces, and is there something you came across in your interviews with the respondents? Thank you.
Mizan?
Hi, thank you. It was really a great to hear your talk. My question is actually related to Darshana's one, is on the question of state epistemology. So you invite us to see the bordering epistemology as a very heart of states, its epistemology and citizen making. So I was actually curious to know how that states epistemology make. Is it that is something that modern states othering in the border as a way of as a tool of othering, that kind of thinking of the state, or what's the role of the domestic discourses about the about the border areas. For example, from Bangladesh side, what we see, it is not only state actions, but states inaction actually is very vital in public discourses. For example, after Falani's that event and all, it was states failed to address that in that geopolitical power hierarchy. That created a very different discourses and sentiments, and states had to deal with it. So together all these, how you think states epistemology is made, particularly in the case of border areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Such important and very sharp questions. And I'll take both your questions together. Actually, they point in slightly different directions, but I'll take it together with Rintu Bora's question also. I think it has echoes, it has overlaps and echoes with both in the chat box, with both Darshana, and Mijan, your questions. So first, Darshana, your question about the slippage between Bengali, Bangladeshi, occurring in, kind of destinations, right, where a lot of these men end up working. I think that is, and I kind of gestured to that as I talked, that it's because of that slippage to a certain extent, right, in as the more and more in this kind of search for the illegal immigrant, it becomes synonymous with Bengali Muslim. And, there's this, I would often use this cover, I think it was around 2012, 13, soon after a lot of these incidents on trains started to happen, right? Especially going towards the south, Bangalore, Kerala. The Outlook magazine in India had this cover where the face of a man was painted with the Bangladeshi flag, right? And so that was very much figured. It was gendered and nationalized in a very particular way, made synonymous in a very particular way. And what I found is that the more there is that slippage and synonymity in the Indian political discourse, the more fragmented and nationalized self-identities become in the borderlands, right? So people begin more and more, again, to Junaid's question of what does a nation mean, much less nation, but these national ascriptions that I'm an Indian Bengali Muslim, not Bangladeshi. I'm not Bangladeshi. You can be Bangladeshi, but I'm not Bangladeshi. I'm Indian, right? So these kinds of self-ascriptions and distinctions become much, much more important. And you can see why, right? So at the first level, what it does is it prompts this, tremendous fear, anxiety, and rush for documentation, for identity documents, right? Like people are thinking about what, should I get an Aadhaar? Should I get a PAN card? Okay, these days PAN card works. No, now we need to get an Aadhaar. Okay, not Aadhaar on the trains you show. So that first there's this big discussion, and and part of that, anxiety is from the very lived experience that even having documents, doesn't protect you from the suspicion and from being charged as imposters, right? That those documents are fake, right? So the policing and surveillance and these accusations of being, are you Indian or are you Bangladeshi? Or you are Bangladeshi because you're a Bengali Muslim. They supersede the possession of documents, right? So legal status, is made much more fragile, and it's much more these kind of social registers. Then you have to tell a story of yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? What, in some cases you might be asked, so tell us, you'll be asked 5 questions. What's the name of your panchayat pradhan, or who's your neighbor? So you're made to give kind of a more social account of yourself, right? And so these are the layers at which people in the borderlands are at pains actually to distinguish between one another. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful ways in which bordering is working today. Is not just the interception and the policing and that discourse, but in these kinds of internalized, conscripted ways in which people are, participating in these processes of national distinction amongst themselves. So that's one. And that's very closely related to the question of discourse that, both Mijan and Rintu, you are asking, but specifically about state discourse. Mijan, I think you make a really, really good point, not just about Bangladeshi state inaction in case of Pelani. And as I just said, Bangladeshi state maintains that there are no unauthorized, undocumented migrants from Bangladesh and India. So, that's not a conversation one can have. So while that is one kind of denial or inaction, the other kind of, I would say, investment in a lot of discourse or a lot of speech is by India and Bangladesh equally to call this a friendly border, right? So there are, and I think this is a very important point. This is a very important aspect for us to remember and really understand that it's not just the Indian state telling a geopolitical story about this border, but it's a collaborative production of a discourse of a friendly border, and therefore kind of obscuring the kind of policing or security regimes that go on in everyday life, but can be denied because this is a friendly border and we're in cooperation. The states are in cooperation with one another, right? So of course, there can't be the kind of militarized violence that happens in the Northeast, or that's required in the Chittagong Hill Tracts or in Kashmir, because this is not that kind of place, right? So that discourse of friendliness, the friendly border, gives cover to state discourses, right? To state practices, to state security regimes. And Rintu, to your question, I completely agree with you. And one of the my goal in today's talk, for instance, and in a lot of my writing, is to as I say, to make us actually look away from the structures that we fixate on, the fence, the structures of very spectacular violence, or this terminology of the legal, illegal, or migrant illegality, but to turn, as I tried to do today, to really the lives and words and frames of analysis of in the case of my talk today, of young men coming of age in these borderlands, and see what kinds of frameworks they are interested in talking about. And they're interested in talking about livelihood challenges. They're interested in talking about agrarian distress. They're talking about, labor exploitation, whether on the, factory floor in Dhaka, or precariously climbing up, sites of construction in Delhi, right? In the same vein as the risks and vulnerabilities to policing and violent policing and security in the borderlands, right? So those are the terms in which they want to talk about the violence of bordering in these borderlands. And I think it's very, that's my sort of very, very modest hope, is that we can, even in resisting, countering discourses of migrant illegality, we're still participating in very national frames of conversation and politics. And I think reframing the terms of the conversation, very much as you suggest, I think is super, super important if we are to both recognize and build more transnational terms of solidarity and analysis, political analysis.
I'm going to, unfortunately, have to call a stop to the conversation, not because there isn't enough interest, but I think we have taken up a lot of Sahana's time. Sahana, we will send you the questions that are in chat if you don't have a chance to look at it now as well. But I want to thank you all for sticking around, and also congratulate Sahana on a wonderful new book. Sahana, one of the questions that came very early and the person had to leave was about the generativity of the term borderlands. Like, is it one that can be confined anymore? Or are there new borderlands being produced because we now have an infrastructure of how to surveil, etc.? So I think that's, a great way to connect back to your concluding remarks as well. Thank you, everybody. Jai Bhim. And I hope to see you again at our next conversation, which will be with Arivu on October 7th in live in concert. And then also Hafsa, who will be here talking about a brand new book, Colonizing Kashmir, in November. And we continue. So onwards, and see you all very soon. Sahana, if you could just stick around for 1 second, that would be fantastic.